desired relationship to carry out the work of OPPD. And again, the majority of the board shows level of agreement around all of these policies. So that was good and that was encouraging. The unity of control policy did show that there were 3 board members with disagreement around that, and we'll potentially dive into that later, but I thought that was interesting. And BL9 was interesting because there was 1 strongly disagree and 1 disagree. And if we move to the next slide for survey results. The statement here was, as a board member, I believe the policy sufficiently reflects the desired strategic direction for OPPD. And here, while there is primarily a majority of agreement for all but resource planning, I think there's a lot more disagreement here, and I think that's important to highlight. There seems to be kind of a threshold, as we'll see in the next slide here shortly. I kind of snapped a line at like, hey, it seems that when there's 3 or more in disagreement, there's kind of a distinction to be made in terms of level of disagreement as opposed to 2 or to 1, for example. So if we could move now to the next slide. And what I'd say, I think it's really important to acknowledge there's general agreement, agree, strongly disagree amongst the majority of board members across all, except for SD9, I apologize, I should have caught that earlier, but across all of the GP and BL policies. And then strongly disagree where you had 3 or more, like I said, snapping that line. The policies that showed up here were SD9, SD2, SD4, SD13, and BL5. And I bucket these as potential focus areas because it seems to me to be prudent, and really to your point, Janice, especially if we were to just focus on one, focusing on the one where there's most disagreement, or at least focusing on those with most disagreement, seems to make sense as a possible construct for the board to consider. And then to the right, you see ones where I bucketed where there were like at least 2, or and not at least actually, where there were 2 disagree or strongly disagree. And this was an SD7, BL9, SD11, GP4, and GP15. Are there any questions about the survey results before I kind of hand it back to Eric, who's going to facilitate the broader discussion around prioritization and make sure we're focused on the right policies, really where the board wants to focus today?
Can I make, if I may, one suggestion? When we're talking about the numbers of the SDs, that we always state what it is, especially if we've got other people listening on that may not have that information. I think it's good, rather than just say SD4, say what the policy is.
Yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely, we can do that. Great. Seeing no other questions or hearing no other comments, Eric, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Scott. And also, first of all, I would just like to underscore that when we conducted our interviews with board members, this list that Scott just presented is very much in sync with the list that we heard from you in those interviews and is summarized in our report. So I think there's unanimity of opinion about what policies people feel need to be revisited. I do think that there's, I'm sorry.
Can I interrupt there, Eric?
Just of course, Rick, yeah.
Someone else, Scott, and I think the board members may also comment that we had recent interviews with another group, and I think these also reflect what they found in those interviews. So we have yet another data point to throw in on.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Rick. Also, before we jump into facilitating the discussion about these policies, I thought it would be prudent for us to just take a quick digression and try to address the question that Eric Williams posed at the end of yesterday's meeting. So at the end of yesterday's meeting, Eric, you posed the question of oftentimes we're trying to figure out kind of the board's role with regard to setting direction from a, we do the what, and the CEO, to the CEO and senior management team, we delegate the how. And how do you find that line of demarcation, and how do you fulfill your role as board members under policy governance while acknowledging that there's a line that exists? And so I thought it might be prudent for us to just take a little bit of time and talk about that. And to kind of help illuminate that first, I thought perhaps we could turn to Bill Slayton, because I think Bill has had direct experience in navigating exactly the same line, Eric, in his experience on the SMUD board. So Bill, perhaps we could start this brief digression. And again, we certainly don't want to consume a lot of time talking about this, but a brief digression to talk about this line and this.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, this when Eric raised this question, and we heard it during the interviews too, the what versus how. It struck me that the issue really that issue is really raises a deeper question, and that question is, how do you as a board make sure you understand how management is going to interpret his or her approach to reach the results that are enumerated in the SDs? So understanding that thought process informs how tightly or loosely you draw up the SDs, because there's not really a bright line. Typically you try to stay more general, but you may want to get more specific. But it's important to understand that thought process from management. So you find out, and this is what we did at SMUD, try to find out as a group, what are the implications of increasing or decreasing the specificity of your SDs? And by understanding management's logic, then you become well informed, and you end up with a better crafted SD. So let me give you an example at SMUD. So these kind of conversations were very helpful at SMUD between the board and management, especially during ad hoc meetings, which would happen. And let me give you, and that's where draft language would be hammered out. So let me give you an example. In 2004, one board member of SMUD wanted SMUD to have an undergrounding policy to improve our streets. Great objective, no question, that's an important issue. So after being on the parking lot for a while, it moved to a committee discussion because enough board members felt that was an important thing to talk about. So the chair of the board appointed an ad hoc with 3 board members. I was one of the board members, and the board member who raised the issue was one, and then there was a third person. And I have to tell you, it took 2 years to get to the first version. Now that was, it was spread over several, maybe every month or every 2 months, there'd be an ad hoc meeting that would occur to try to hammer it out. And it ended up coming out, it evolved into a system enhancement policy, because we came to understand through discussions with management that it's not always about undergrounding. It's also about relocating to the back of the lot. We're talking about primarily in commercial corridors. So it evolved into that policy, which include that relocation. So, but there's all sorts of issues. How much to do, how fast, who should pay, what is the role of the cities in the county in Sacramento service territory. So all of those things, as we develop the wording, and you can go on the SMUD website and see the wording, it's been modified about 4 times, that there was a lot of discussion about how management would interpret things and what are the budget implications, and trying to craft in a partnership what words would actually work and give the most flexibility, but reach the objective that the board wanted. So hopefully that's kind of helpful to you.
So Bill, thank you for that. So again, I want to sort of focus on Eric's question about the line between what's and how's. And so Bill, as you navigated the what versus how discussion with regard to the system enhancement policy, help us understand to what extent did that policy result in just what stuff, and to what extent did it result in, quote, how stuff? Do you recall?
Well, it ended up with that, there had to be easements obtained, that there had to be participation by the cities and counties. We weren't going to do this unilaterally as SMUD. And there was a long discussion about what are the budget implications of this? How do we craft something that gives enough financial flexibility to management and yet gives us assurance that that kind of effort is going to move forward in the community?
So the policy included then a requirement that there be participation by the locality. It sounds like it also included a requirement that it be financially feasible. As I recall, there was some budget number actually included in the policy.
Yeah, we would annually commit up to 0.5% of annual gross electric sales revenue to system enhancements, but only if these other conditions are met.
But the point is that those are all kind of how statements. Those are, or they could be framed, I think, as values or principles, guiding principles that you wanted to use to constrain the ways in which this policy would be implemented by the executive team.
Yeah, I might mention, Eric, one more thing, that by having this in the public domain, this policy, it gave everyone a chance, customers, stakeholders, other public agencies, a chance to see, okay, what's the ball game here? So there was no real question about it. You know, we didn't get as many questions after we did this policy as we did before about how's this going to work and how are we going to get money and how are you going to underground our system. So it really helped both management and the board deal with public interest in a topic.
Mm-hmm. So I hear you underlining two key principles here. One is, as you're considering refinements to an SD, make sure you have good communication and information from management and analysis about how they would interpret different versions of the language so that the board is well informed about that as it's drafting the language. I hear that. I also hear this point about you can include values or principles in a policy if you feel it's necessary to ensure some additional guardrails are put up around the specific impact or results you want to achieve. I would make one more point, and then I want to make sure we open it up to just a little bit of discussion amongst board members, which is if you go to GP2 in OPPD's policies, it says the board shall set policies, the board shall direct, evaluate, and inspire the organization through the establishment of written policies reflecting the board's standards. The board's major policy focus will be on the OPPD's intended impacts outside the organization, not on the functions or methods used to achieve those results. And so when we go through the discussion about the SDs today, I think the question I'll be asking repeatedly is, what's the impact you want to achieve? What's the result you want to achieve? And if you are envisioning the highest level first of what that impact can be, let's articulate that and understand that. And if you're not happy with kind of that logic, then perhaps we step down to a narrower definition of the impact, and perhaps through that process of continually asking what's the ultimate impact you're trying to achieve, we can keep it focused on the board's policymaking. So with all that, Eric, I'm going to turn to you first, actually, because you're the one who raised the question yesterday, and see what questions you might have for Bill or just in general comments you might want to make about this conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate revisiting this, and I also appreciate highlighting the GP2 guidelines there. I think that's a good reference for how we understand what the intended outcome should be. I think that if we look at the SDs and the responses we got in the survey, it does seem as though some of those that do have more specifics are more clear, and so the understanding is by the board of what of the metrics for the report, and then the interpretation of the policy is clear. And so I'm curious if we look across the areas where there is more specificity, we have found more agreement on success, and areas where there's less specificity, we have found a little bit wider diversity of response. And so it seems like, as you highlighted, understanding how this will be interpreted during implementation is an important step forward. I appreciate you putting it that way, because I'm taking notes over here, and that's definitely something I want to keep in mind as we talk about which policies and what updates we might need to make.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are there other board members who wish to make comments on this discussion before we move right into the discussion about specific SDs?
Yeah, my hand's up, I think.
I see. Yeah, I see your hand go up, Rick. Thank you.
Yeah, so let me just echo happiness at the way that you have framed this. I've struggled with the concept that there's a bright line between how and what, and really this goes back to my opening comments yesterday is that I struggled with the various interpretations and the precision of language and expectations among all parties.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very happy to hear the value of a public domain discussion, the necessity of having a good conversation between board and management, the real world experience that sometimes these things take a long time, and the reference to GP2, and then lastly to Director Williams' comment, the note that some of our least troublesome SDs are the ones that have the greatest amount of metrics tied to them. So that's very good.
Thank you, Rick. Well, so Craig, I see your hand is up as well.
Yeah, just quickly, I would echo what Eric and Rick just said, just so that there's some relative consensus on the board around the idea that the intentionality and specificity in these strategic directives is important, so as to ensure interpretation isn't a guessing game. I don't know that we have a chronic problem with that, but I would imagine that were we to get into some questions about how interpretation exists between the CEO and senior management, there might be some divergence there. So I'm echoing that as being important, while not conflating that with so much specificity around the outcome that it doesn't provide senior management the right level of flexibility to do their work as well. So, and to me, I think that's what I would say is the interesting and fun balance to find, is where we provide the right direction at the right level, and then let senior management do their thing to go out and achieve it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And so now let's go ahead and dive into the discussion about specific policies. I think it probably makes sense just to start with SD9, since that's the one at the top of this list. And so again, as we get into this discussion, I'm going to be asking, what are the intended impacts you want to articulate through this policy? What are your concerns about it? And we're not trying to solve the policy question today. We're really trying to understand to what level is this the highest priority for the board and the board's work plan to get into in the coming year. So again, it's prioritization today, not solution today. I want to make sure we talk to each board member, and so I'm going to be calling on each person to talk. So it's not, you don't have to raise your hand, because rest assured, I do want to hear from each of you as we go through each of these. I do want to hear initially just again, why SD9? Why does that rise to the top here, and what is it you want to achieve that that is not clear yet? So let me start perhaps with Ann McGuire. Ann, if I could just ask you to start and tell us your thoughts about SD9.
This SD has always been a conundrum for me, because it seems like whether or not this could just be a how, whether or not we can put more of the information as far as what we want in these resources in other SDs versus that. I guess, is this a what versus a how? I think the first question that we really have to decide is whether or not the entire group feels that this is an important SD to have, or whether or not it can be placed somewhere else, divided up and put someplace else. I guess that's the first question that comes to my mind. Not
so Ann, let me try to reframe the question, because I really want to hear just what you think as opposed to what you think your colleagues think. Do you think there's additional information with regard to resource planning or environmental leadership? Is there additional information or intended impact that you think it's important for the board to communicate?
When we first wrote this SD, I totally agreed with that fact, that we needed that. But now that we have SD7, I'm wondering whether or not we do need it, because I think all of it would go underneath SD7 environmental sensitivity with our net zero carbon, because I think that is what's going to be driving the next 35, 40 years, is that SD. And that is the SD that will be changing as more technology comes around and everything. I think that's where we'll be changing that SD7 environmental sensitivity. So I feel all of these resources really go underneath SD7. I guess that's my thought.
And again, just again to you to keep asking, is there an additional impact that you think OPPD should be trying to articulate in whatever policy, whether SD7 or SD9, that is not clearly already articulated? Is there something missing, if you will?
At this stage, I don't think there is, because I think that already management is working with their strategic plans and their long-term strategic plans. I think they've already put it in place. And I want to give them the flexibility to decide exactly what is the best resources to use, rather than we to dictate, I want you to do this much by this much time, by this much time. I think that adds an added burden to them.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that you rest easy with the level of communication of direction that exists in current policy with regard to environmental leadership and resource planning, and want to provide the flexibility to staff to then interpret how to do that.
Correct. And I think perhaps where, everyone wants to know right away, well, where are we on this path? And management has tried to give us a long-term payout on when we're, as far as, planning this out, when they're going to give us reports and everything. And I think if we start adding extra stuff, are we going to add just an added burden to that? And again, what is the secondary consequence to us adding that added burden to that?
The added constraints. You want to understand if there are implications of adding additional constraints on the policy.
Yes.
All right, Amanda, can I turn to you next? So same questions, kind of, are there things that you feel SD9 or SD7 fail to articulate that are important impacts that the board wants to achieve?
Sure, I think that, sorry, I have a little bit of echo. I think the comments that I provided regarding SD13, the stakeholder outreach and engagement. I'm sorry. Yep, that's 13. Okay. Saw an 11 for a second. And really the marriage between resource planning and stakeholder outreach, I feel like that needs to be strengthened. So, I mean, maybe to Ann's point, is there an aspect that just needs to reside under stakeholder engagement with that? Do we really need resource planning specifically to have a component of that? I'm not sure. I also think that the resource planning strategic directive is probably written in to support the way that resource planning used to be done. But I think that with load growth, with resource technologies changing so much, that resource planning effort is much more dynamic than, a once a year plan or a once every 5-year plan. And so that's something that I think needs to be contemplated and considered when we're rewriting this one.
So again, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, Amanda, but I'm trying to understand if you feel from a standpoint of what results you want OPPD to achieve. Is there something missing? Is there something missing right now?
I think there is, but I don't know what it is. I don't know how to articulate it.
Okay. So you're kind of in a curious mode of trying to understand kind of what that might be. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So Eric Williams, let me ask you next to again comment on what your thinking is with regard to SD9 and SD7. What is missing? What impacts or results are you not seeing articulated here that you believe the board should be articulating, if any?
Yeah, well, I'd like to start by echoing what Ann said. I do feel like with regards to carbon and action on climate change, that SD7 moving from a carbon intensity to a total carbon measurement and a net zero goal by 2050 was a big step forward in that specific area. And so I do think that SD7 handles that well, and that does not need additional specification under SD9. So my comments on SD9 are more around additional areas that would feel relevant to the resource planning process, that would have a big impact to the way we carry out our resource planning and determination of future needs, but that so far aren't being accounted or measured and reported annually with a metric in a way that we can kind of understand the changes that are happening. And I mentioned this during the SD9 monitoring report a couple weeks ago, that the last IRP has specific bullets. So our February 2017 IRP has specific bullets for large areas that were specifically indicated as expected to influence the demand. And a few of those included electrified transportation, distributed generation, energy efficiency, and I would say more broadly, the idea of beneficial electrification in other areas, that those aren't inherently measured as we talk about carbon emissions, but they are important enough, as Amanda said, in how we're doing our future resource planning activities, that I feel like a metric and a clear examination of the progress would be relevant. And in a couple of those areas, I feel like OPPD has a disproportionate or nearly sole impact into the way we can see success in our community. So with electrified transportation, for example, as the only provider, if we are not a leader in that area, there is basically no likelihood that Omaha and the metro area and our service territory will be advancing into that area. And that is something that I think is important. I think there are benefits aside from the carbon that I think, and I think it does merit investigation and a metric and monitoring in the resource planning annual report. And this does appear in one of the orange boxes in the resource planning report, that the inputs that go into the resource planning process cover these areas. And so I think that there are a few different specific things that are not detailed by carbon emissions alone. And I want to be really careful in bringing up something I mentioned last year, but I highlighted a rhetorical question about, if we were 100% renewable or 100% non-carbon energy, is it still inherently worthwhile to pursue energy efficiency and energy conservation? And again, I don't want to seek an answer now, but I think that's a worthwhile question, and that is separate from the carbon emission question, but very relevant to the resource planning discussion. And so those are some of the things that I think I would like to see achieved and measured and included in a monitoring report.
So bottom line, you would like to see included in the SD specific mention of, as you listed it, electrification of transportation, beneficial electrification in other areas, energy efficiency, distributed generation. You'd like to see those things enumerated as, call them values, call them principles, call them investments that you want to see OPPD making. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and I do feel like those are outcomes into the community, as you highlighted under GP2, our impacts into the community unto themselves, and that I would like to see increased in the future, that I feel there is additional value. And so indicating that through the policy, I feel is important.
Okay, great. Appreciate the clarity of that. Janice, let me turn to you next. What is your view?
So, as I said when we talked about the monitoring report, the last bullet in SD9, to ensure that all integrated resource plans support and align with all OPPD's strategic directives, that bullet needs to go away because it's too broad and too ambiguous. And if there are certain aspects of other SDs we want to bring into this SD, then we should be more specific in that. That just makes an impossible task for management to meet that bullet for sure. And I agree with with Eric's opinion that there's more to resource planning than just environmental. And so I don't think that we can cover all of resource planning just through SD7, because it's also, resource planning also has to encompass or could also encompass transmission and distribution and distributed energy, and as Eric said, electric vehicle charging and all of those things that isn't really generation. Resources have to do with all of our capital investments and not just capital investments and programs to mitigate impacts on the utility of both demand and generation. So I think some of those other things can be included in a resource planning document that we don't currently have now.
And again, to you is the question, you think that the board needs to be articulating that from the board's perspective, these investments and the things that Eric listed are important results or impacts that we want to achieve.
Right. I mean, I would want to know what the entire board would want included in this SD, but those are some things that I think the board could consider to include in a revision.
I actually am trying to ask you what you think
should
be included.
So yes, those are the things that I think should be included.
Okay, good. So what I'm hearing you say is essentially to echo Eric's desire that the board be more specific in listing the kinds of investments that OPPD should be making in order to assure, call it environmental leadership, call it, call it what you will, whatever frame you put it under, but you're in alignment with him with regard to that.
Right, and maybe just some benchmarks for energy efficiency and demand management and those kinds of things. If you want to be some metrics that would get us aligned to whatever the board thought that would be.
So again, I want to talk to each board member, so I'm going to get to each of you in turn. Rick, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, some hazy and some more precise. Just to go quickly off of last month's meeting and our review of SD9, I think it is important to have a strong look. When should this planning take place? Certainly when load changes from declining to rising in the course of 2 years, we should do some kind of deep resource planning. Where I struggle on this is I think it's almost a transition business model that I would like to see encompassed here. OPPD is mission is to provide energy services, and those I would like to know how those energy services transform and change as we move into decarbonization and accept new technologies. What can we as a board, how can we indicate our anticipation, acceleration of some of these? Director Molhoff mentioned energy efficiency. I certainly think that there should be a strong preference for prevention, a strong preference for megawatt savings as an approach to avoid new generation. I would like to see some of the trade-offs that occur, almost a dollar cost averaging approach of investment in new generation technologies. Certainly our first wind was expensive, but you are buying down the cost of wind when you technology as you help it scale up. That is also true for solar and storage. So, you know, having some different kinds of understanding of what question, how we're trying to shape the market.
Mm-hmm.
So let me throw one. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just want to make sure that we stay focused on the question at hand, which is what do you as a board member feel is lacking or needs to be added to the current SD9/SD7, because we're kind of bunching them together here. But what do you think is missing, Rick, in terms of the articulation of the board's intended impacts that OPPD is supposed to, is to achieve?
It's not clear to me what question SD9 currently is answering. So let me use as an example the cost effectiveness tests that there are 5 cost effectiveness tests for energy efficiency. One that used to be used by OPPD was, will utility rates increase? That's fine as far as it goes, but there's another one that says, will the total cost of energy in the utility surface area increase or decrease? Those are 2 very different questions.
Mm-hmm.
And the board, I think that Rick feels that I would prefer that second question more than the first. And it's not clear to me that we have that kind of intentionality when we talk about resource planning.
So again, I'm going to keep trying to pin you down as to kind of like what's missing from your standpoint. Then forget whether it's an SD9 or SD7, and the question of kind of what's the purpose of SD9. I'm really trying to say, I think stepping back, what's missing that you feel needs to be articulated in this area as a board?
Language that I think could be used to improve it would be to give it to SD9 when it should occur, whether that's as loads are go in different directions or a periodicity, an emphasis on energy efficiency and prevention, language that moves us towards our recognition that we have control of the market based on the incentives we put in place for our energy users and those who are also producers, are prosumers. How we shape the market is something that should be resource planning.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you for getting me there.
So let me go to Mike Kavanaugh next. Mike, your thoughts on what's missing, if anything, from the current ST9 and ST7 policies related to resource planning?
All right, I'm fine as written. It would help if we could have these SDs on the screen discussing them. Don't.
To have the STs on the screen? Well, we can go ahead and do that. Perhaps, Mo, I could ask you to put ST9 on the screen just for the benefit of folks who want to be able to see it.
Thank you.
And so Mike, but you're not right now seeing anything that you feel is missing from the standpoint of what the board needs to be saying are the intended impacts with regard to its resource planning.
No, I'm fine.
Correct?
I'm fine.
Okay. Thank you. Tim Gay, your thoughts?
Yes. Yeah, I'm fine with it too. I answered it's fine. But listening to the last comments, I mean, I hear the problem. There's so many different opinions on what that resource planning should look like, but there's not one So there's not one objective that management can go say, well, these would be the key results to achieve your objective. It's just all over the place. So I think that's part of the struggle. And it's a flowing thing. Before we shut down Fort Calhoun, we were fine. Then you get two big projects, Facebook, Google, others, and all of a sudden we're not so fine. So it's an evolving process. And I think sometimes just needs to be patience. It'll work out. But I do think our process is correct. And I know management's always trying to look as far in the future as you can, but none of us have a perfect crystal ball. So I would just suggest as we go forward, if it's one or two objectives you want to change, let's get a consensus and get that on the board. So, but other than that, I agree with where we're at right now.
So I'm not hearing you suggest that there's anything missing from the standpoint of what the board should be saying in these policies.
I think it's fine as it is. I was just kind of adding where I think some of the problem is that I've heard over the years.
So, so Craig, your thoughts on this question?
So a couple things. One is my most vivid recollection from this conversation last year was the articulation from senior management that SD 9, as currently written, doesn't provide them any guidance whatsoever. It's not helpful. So, as written, to me, that really struck me, and it continues to kind of weigh on my mind. So, if in my mind we set it aside and start over, then I'm asking myself the question, what's the outcome we're trying to achieve here? So for me, really what's on my mind, and perhaps this is a little bit too howish, but here's where I'm at. When it comes to resource investments that the utility is going to make, and I think defining what those potential resource investments might be makes some sense so that we have a sense for what resource planning really even is and have a common understanding. But when it comes to resource investments, I want to be sure that we're making decisions that, one, are based in sound data, that two, align with our mission, which that might be unnecessary because that's in other strategic directives, that three, use thorough and sophisticated analysis, and that four, appropriately incorporate input from the public. When I think about resource planning, those are some of the guiding principles that come to mind. I'm confident that I'm missing something important, but those are the ones that are on my mind. And then going back to the first thing that I said, I think this is extraordinarily important for the board to eventually come to some consensus around, which I think could be tricky, but I think it's important. But I think we really need to make sure that we get senior management's input on how we can provide better direction that might give them some clarity around what we're looking for. And I know that that's there, but what I don't want is for us to just kind of continue to trudge forward without some sort of triangulation and understanding for what senior management really needs in terms of direction and guidance.
So Craig, if I can summarize what I hear you saying, are you saying that you think those four principles you laid out should be actually articulated by the board in its SD as principles around which its OPPD's resource planning is done? So to recap, you would include as principles in its resource planning alignment with mission based on a thorough analysis and factual data and input from the public.
Yeah, yes. And again, I think that feels a little bit too howish, right? We're describing how the utility goes through a resource planning exercise and the way in which it does. So maybe it's not as outcomes focused and what, it doesn't get to the what as much as I would like, but that's at least from my standpoint, when I'm just trying to put myself in a position of, okay, it's time to approve a big investment. What do I want to know has happened in order for me to get comfortable making that decision? And so for me, that's about confidence in the process that we went through. I am by no means suggesting that these are not things that we're doing today. I think, in fact, as demonstrated in our SD9 monitoring report last month, the level of sophistication and analysis that went into the Power with Purpose work was fantastic, leading edge. So I think in many ways this is an articulation of what I think is happening already. So yeah, I think to your question, Eric, yeah, I think that's generally where I'm at.
So I would like to just kind of call the board's attention to a couple of other policies that I've been looking at from OPPD, where the kind of principles or kind of values that I hear you articulating, Craig, are incorporated, just to kind of show what that could look like. Because I think you're looking for, like, is this appropriate or not? Should we be including this in the policies or not? So Mo, if I could ask you to go to the existing SD2 policy for OPPD. So this is the rates policy. We're going to come back to it a little later on as we talk about the rates policy, because this is something you've surfaced as one you want to talk about. But I would just point out that as I read this, you have things in here that kind of express principles or values that you want upheld in the development of rates for OPPD. You can look at these 6 bullets and see, offering flexibility and options, be simple and easy to understand. I don't want to dive into the details here, but it's an illustration, Craig, I think, of the kind of principle approach to refining your SDs that might apply to whether you do it in SD9 or SD7. It could help give further voice to what it is the board wants to achieve. If we could also look at SD1 just briefly, Mo, I would appreciate that. Here again, you see in the mission policy, if you look at in implementing this vision, OPPD shall adhere to these principles. Certain principles are described here. And so I can imagine in a future SD 7/9, you might do something similar to this as well, without necessarily getting down. And again, I'm not advocating one way or the other, but as you sort of think about the way in which you want to articulate the board's desires for achieving the impacts of environmental leadership, resource planning, intelligence, the addition of principles might be a way to approach that. If we can go back to SD9 mode now, I've said my piece on that. So Tim, I wanted to turn to you next. You've heard, the board members all talk about kind of what their thinking is about SD9/7. I've heard 3 of them say they'd like to include at least some language with being more specific about the kinds of investments they want to see OPPD make. I've heard 5 step back a little bit from that specificity of investment, but want to be more clear about perhaps principles. At least a couple of people said that. So just curious again, Tim, your reaction, thoughts as you've heard the discussion so far.
Yeah, so I go back to we spent about, I don't know, 8 hours maybe on resource planning with the board in 2019. Really a deep dive on resource planning and including integrated resource planning. We do dynamic resource planning every day, every season, annually, as we put together a budget for us to begin to think about all the resources that we currently have. And I think to Craig's point, I think the decision on adding or subtracting may or may not be. I mean, I look back in our 2014 deep plan that we did on future resources, that still had Fort Calhoun in that when we made the decision in 2016 to cease operations in 2016. And so I think what happens in all of this is that we do that, and the resource plan is not meant to necessarily drive market changes. It's meant to really understand where our supply demand implications look like, what they look like over some period of time, and then how do we balance all of those for an optimum decision. And so I think that this is the reason why this one is struggled and is because you have these varying perspectives of what it is and what it isn't. And so I would say, resource planning is not meant to drive technology and transformational market changes. I think that's different than resource planning and even integrated resource planning. Now, in some of the conversations that occurred here today, we do take all of those elements: energy conservation, distributed energy, increasing load, whether that's EV, whether that's industrial, whether that's other electrification that we see in a variety of areas in our planning, as we did with the Power with Purpose. And then we begin to take all of those and say, hey, based on what we believe that growth and demand is, here's the resources that become the most economical. And in the case last year on Power with Purpose, we began to say, listen, we're going to also evaluate not just on cost, but also environmental, and begin to think about how that begins to us to balance out the strategic directive that the board approved last fall, and we knew that was a conversation that was going on. So to me, I think we're trying to mesh a couple things together that don't necessarily fit, and from an organization and an industry that pretty much does integrated resource planning and understands how it's done within the industry, I think it's kind of those individual kind of board perspectives that you heard about. Well, I want to make sure that we add this and we force an outcome, and that's not what resource planning is. There are other things that we can force outcomes, right? Whether we say, hey, we want to move by 2030 to have 30% of the homes in Omaha with distributed energy, or we want a 25% saturation by 2040 in electric vehicles. Okay, those are things that we would begin to put together programs on and say, here's the cost to be able to drive that change. Now, with that resource plan, as I see the trends of those kind of market changes, now my resource plan may change because of that. So I think what I hear is we're trying to tie multiple things together, and to me that actually is part of the reason why I think it's confusing this resource planning. And then the other piece is I agree on the stakeholder process, and in a traditional integrated resource plan where it's not a decision today on an item, that we would actually get that stakeholder input. And depending on that outcome, really gather that feedback, gather that input, and begin to identify what that looks like. And I would certainly concede the stakeholder process in that would be really important. So.
Mm-hmm. So if I could summarize what I'm hearing from you, Tim, it is, if the board wants to articulate specific investments or impacts, such as in electrical vehicle penetration or energy efficiency, then okay, we should have that conversation. We should decide kind of what that level should be. But let's not confuse that with resource planning, which is an ongoing responsibility that management takes on and is in response to the strategic directives that the board articulates.
Right.
Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think it is, because I think what happens when you force those elements on, it may be a suboptimal solution. Not that that's wrong, but let's separate those out. And I think there are two different kind of activities and functions that the utility would need to look at and do. And I'll let maybe Javier or Mary, who's kind of in that vein of activity, add anything they'd like to add.
Well, I see Eric's hand up, and so I do want to make sure we have a lot of policies to get through, and so I also want to make sure if one of the points you're making here, Tim, is an important one, which is what's the board's role with regard to resource planning versus the board's role with regard to articulating, its intended impacts, and then we respond as management to the resource plan to achieving those things. We bring back, and as we're articulating those, as the board is trying to articulate what impacts it wants to achieve, of course, we're bringing back analysis of what the impacts and consequences of those investments or those things might be. So the board is well informed as it decides whether or not to adopt that policy. Am I speaking clearly, and is that correct?
I think that's relatively accurate.
So. Yep. So again, let me go back to you, Eric, as you've listened to the conversation. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I appreciate what Tim is saying and the difference between the resource planning activity of making sure we have the right generation to the needs that we have. Absolutely, I would agree that the activities that were done with Power with Purpose in the Efficient Frontier were admirable, and I appreciate that. I guess I would be curious if either Eric or Bill, you have advice about how some of those other outcomes might be specified if it is not an SD9 resource planning activity. Where might we find that? And I suggest SD9 because, again, the integrated resource plan does specify these specific things. So I don't know another SD which would cover this. We have talked in the past about maybe looking at something about market transformation or some other type of a more innovative, focused strategic directive to cover this type of an area. And if this is not resource planning, I also don't believe it is specific to the environmental sensitivity strategic directive. What is the best way for us to identify the transformation that, as Rick pointed out, can only be accomplished by and with strong participation and leadership from OPPD, because again, we are the sole provider, we make the market. So there are things that cannot be accomplished without us. Where can we discuss and highlight forward direction and policies to get to those outcomes if it isn't in resource planning? If there's another area, I would be very open to hearing that discussion as well.
A good question. And I think the question you're really asking is if having a policy around resource planning confuses our role with that of staff in doing the resource planning, how do we frame this policy in a way that maintains our role as setting direction without implying or stepping into the role that management has? Bill, how would you respond to what Eric just asked?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is when I look at SD7 and the second bullet, SD7 in the second bullet says that has the strives for the goal of net zero carbon production by 2050. So I assume, although in my experience in SMUD, this environmental stewardship mainly focuses on the internal operations of the utility, but I think this language implies, if I'm reading it correctly, this is overall, including what you generate through delivering electrical services.
That's correct.
So if that's the case, if you took that particular sentence, and let's just say, for example, it were placed within SD9. So it becomes part of, when you do your resource planning, we as a board then would be saying to management, keep in mind that we have this goal out there at 2050. Now, what SMUD did is went a bit further in its SD9 to put interim goals. So again, you're tightening what's happening, but you're not getting to specific ways in which to do that, the hows to do it. But they're certainly sending a message to management to say, hey, you've got a 2020 goal, a 2030 goal and 2040 goal. So tell me how you're approaching in your resource plan with that piece of it in mind.
Bill, was some of that driven by state legislation as well?
Actually, no, actually SMUD was ahead of all of it. Some of it ended up being in state legislation, but SMUD, they're kind of focused always on trying to be a leader. So that's what happens when you try to be a leader.
Yep.
So I apologize for jumping in one more time, Eric, but in that category, outside of our own operations, as we are upstream to a majority of others in our community, we even recently received a request from the city of Omaha in their carbon disclosure project filings. We have a responsibility to help them achieve their decarbonization outcomes outside of our own operations. And I do, again, appreciate the net zero carbon with our generation and within our operations, but extending that to assuming that other areas also wish to achieve decarbonization on a similar timeline, where can we find language to help look toward those outcomes? Because, for example, Omaha Metro Transit purchased compressed natural gas buses recently. I consider that a miss. I'm disappointed that those are not electric buses. And we don't have an active partnership in moving towards electrified transit, as far as I know. We have some work in electrified vehicles. We'll hear about that in the SD7 report in a couple weeks. But there are areas that are outside of our generation, and I'm curious how we can how we can incorporate those into some form of a policy that we would see reflected in a monitoring report.
Yeah. If I could just speak to, and I think one of the questions you're asking, Eric, is just kind of what's the overall frame of the policy that we could be using that would enable us to capture these key areas that we wish to express our desired impacts in. And really, in my experience working with different utilities and other boards, the field is kind of wide open as far as kind of how you want to frame this. You could frame a market transformation policy. That could be an SD. You could frame it as an innovation SD with regard to market innovation. So I think, personally, as I listen to this discussion, I think one of the ways to potentially help steer clear of the confusion is to potentially avoid the resource planning language and go find some other way of framing this overall, these goals. And I get that environmental stewardship may not be fully encompassing enough, and so therefore we need to find another place to put it.
I might, Eric, just
Eric, I just got to add. I think what Eric's trying to get to, which I think the senior team is driving through our decarbonization strategic initiative that focuses in on. I put it in the chat on all customers, whether it's governmental, whether it's commercial, industrial, residential, whether it's other community things like rail, number of other community activities, whether it's a generation portfolio for OPPD or whether it is really around internal operations from OPPD, such as Bill was talking about with SMUD. So out of that decarbonization strategic initiative will come very clear deliverables and actions about going forward. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't show up necessarily in a strategic directive today, but what's driving that is the SD7 on net zero carbon by 2050. So out of that will come a deep stakeholder process to get feedback from customers on willingness, perspective, insights, agree, don't agree. And so we'll have some outcomes that we'll be sharing with the board to say, hey, based on the feedback, based on current technology, based on information, here's the direction that we're recommending we go around this decarbonization strategy. So I think I think part of it is in this process, and what I get a little anxious about is jumping to the answer before we step through that strategic initiative work. And so I felt compelled I needed to share that. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So Bill, hold on. I just want to, because I think we're kind of up against it in terms of time on this one.
Okay.
Craig, I'm just going to turn to you and kind of ask, as you hear the sense of your colleagues, I mean, we're going to take the temperature at the end of this workshop today on kind of what the priorities are for the work plan. But as you hear your colleagues, is there anything additional you would say in terms of the level of prioritization you think this area of focus for the board should receive in the coming year?
Well, I think it should be a high priority. We identified it as a need last year. I don't know that anything has changed. I am really sensitive to and agree with Tim's point that we don't want to leap over the decarbonization initiative and try and create something that would inevitably inform by that. But it seems that there's enough meat on the bones for us to continue a conversation around that. Now, if your question is about prioritization, we've only talked about one, so it's hard to know whether it's more important given the ones we haven't talked about, but it seems important to me.
And that's my conclusion too, is that this is certainly an area where you clearly want to have on your work plan more work on thinking about how to express the board's intended impacts here, while at the same time hearing from management an update on its decarbonization strategy and initiatives and how that work plays into what the board might want to further articulate. So, Bill Slate, I didn't mean to cut you off. I do want, if you have a final word here, I do want to go on to another policy before we take a break.
Well, and I'll just very, very quickly, and it goes to this will be in the ultimate discussion that we're doing, but I noticed that in SMUD's SD7, it does say SMUD will provide leadership in the reduction of the region's total emissions of greenhouse gases through proactive programs and all of SMUD's activities. So it does actually give board direction to for management to show them the progress that's being made in those areas as part of environmental leadership and stewardship.
Mm-hmm. So let's kind of put a pin on this conversation, and if we can, before we take a break, just go to one more of the SDs, and that's the rates policy, SD2. Mo, perhaps we can go to that policy on the screen. We certainly heard through our interviews, and I think we saw it confirmed in the comments on this, that there are a couple of things going on here in terms of board members' concerns. So I would like to hear briefly from each board member kind of what your areas of concern about this policy are. Amanda, I know you had a hand up previously, and so I don't want to ignore you with regard to the previous conversation, but perhaps you would be so kind to jump to SD2 for me and tell me your thoughts about
Sure.
SD2.
Yeah, so I noted that this one needed to be revised just basically because of the sunset date that is at the end of next year. So we cannot possibly think that we can revise this between next August and next December to address that. So I would like for us, I appreciate the recommendation to focus on one policy change a year. I think that that's a fair request. This one, and perhaps at the moment, only just needs to be revised to address the date change. But then I also think that there's maybe an opportunity to look further at affordability metrics. You know, with the question of being what's the outcome we're looking for. You know, we want, I think, you know, we want to make sure that we are providing affordable electricity. And so is really the cost of, you know, kilowatt hour compared to the Northwest region, or excuse me, the North Central region, the actual fair metric of affordability. I think that that needs to be called into question and reevaluated.
So looking at hands up, I want to make sure if somebody is burning to talk about this one, that you show me a hand. So Denise, for you, the SD2 policy, what comes to your mind that you feel is missing from here or needs to be addressed in future work by the board?
You know, I had the same concern as Amanda about the sunset date of the first sentence in the SD, and that really does need to be addressed. But really looking at affordability indicators and how are we considering energy burden related to other areas, and not just because that goes into bills and making sure that really is an affordable indicator that I think could really drive some changes in our rate making. That's all I had, is just to include energy burden and clean up that first sentence.
Rick, what are your thoughts on this one?
Thank you. Similar to the others, I really have to commend senior management for doing a really nice job of the improvement on monitoring affordability indicators is stark and dramatic over what it was when we first came in. I think SD2 rates is the only SD we have that comes close to measuring affordability, which is a third of our mission. And I would like to see it articulate what that is. Right now, we're just monitoring. I would like to get to some kind of metric there that would allow us to have a usable indicator that we can communicate to the public affordability. This will, I think, necessarily, thank you, Director Molhoff, for mentioning energy burden. I think it gets to equity. I have no idea what we are allowed to do within the statutes or where we will end up on that. But I do think we need to pursue that. Lastly, I think good metrics are important here. Having if there is a national uniform data set that we can turn to, and if we are using metrics that are time series and not just year over year, and comparing not just ourselves but our peers, and us, I think that would really be helpful.
Thank you, Rick. Who else wants to comment on this rates policy?
I would just chime in to just echo. I think that both of the kind of overarching issues of an affordability metric and that lingering date are two issues that I think we need to take a look at.
Mm-hmm.
If we are looking for echoes on those two topics, I would agree. Affordability and the date issue, as Craig said, are important. I would also be in favor of talking about ways that we can have rates that are prepared for the future. And I mention that now, knowing that we are having an ongoing discussion about rate updates related to hardware improvements and the ability to change those things. So I'm not sure that we need to, that now is the appropriate time to talk about SD guidance on rates preparing for the future. But I do think that's an important note that we should keep in mind as we talk about the biannual rate update timeline that we're considering and how we have policy that matches the potential future work that we know is going to be happening. So in the current version, the timeline and the affordability, but as a future discussion point, I don't know when we should examine how do we make sure the policy matches what we've talked about as known updates in hardware, software, and potential rate structure.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to speak about the rates policy?
Speak up.
Amanda, was that you?
Let Mike go first.
Thanks, Amanda.
Okay.
I think the SD is worded appropriately, particularly when we focus on the first bullet, and then we have to establish our rates within the law. And I think we do. I know there is some feeling amongst board members about wanting to have our rates adjusted based upon a person's income. That's what you mean by affordability, I presume. That would not be legal to do, is my understanding. Appropriate. We shouldn't have one customer paying more electricity than another one simply because he makes more income. I also feel probably our survey shows some of the rumblings on that was on this particular issue was based upon the base rate. I'm sure that some members of the board are not happy with our current base rate structure. But beyond that, I don't have anything to add.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mike. Amanda?
Yeah, I'll clarify one point. When I'm talking about affordability, I'm not suggesting that we have a separate rate for someone based on their income level. I think that when we take our total revenue divided by our total generation to come up with $1 per kWh, that's the rate that we're comparing now to West North Central Regional average. And I think we, with the directional target of being 20%, and I think that that's that metric of the West North Central Regional average. Is that what we need to be comparing to know whether we're affordable or not? So that's the question. And then what I wanted to add was that along with that, the directional rate target of 20% was something that was established a long time ago. And I think that, and a long time being in context, I realize, but I know that there are reasons that we cannot get to that 20% right now, and that's going to continue to be a challenge. So I just wanted to throw out that we also need to look at that directional rate, target as well.
Thank you, Amanda. Okay, seeing no other hands up. Well, no, I think Anne, your hand is up. Go ahead.
I just wanted to echo that we do need this change, especially the first discussion. However, I think that the principles that they give are very important. Those 6 principles to be followed by, I think they're nice, they're strong principles. And I think we have to just look at the idea of changing the idea of no general rate increase, or the directional rate target. I also agree with Amanda that that's not really realistic right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think we've heard then from everybody who wanted to speak on this one. Again, it seems based on the conversation, just as the previous conversation, this one has a high level of interest by board members in being revisited in the coming year. Craig, I will note that we've reached the 2:30 hour, which is when we had planned to do a break. And so I think we had planned for a 15-minute break at this point. So let's go ahead and take that break and come back at 15 minutes to the hour, and we will see you all then. Thank you.
Are you playing the guitar?
Oh, I am playing the guitar. Geez, I thought my sorry about that. It's my stress reliever. They won't let me have alcohol in the office, so no,
Yeah.
I'm just joking. No, it's
I think that's called out in one of the GPs, right? No alcohol in
I
the
think
office.
so. Yeah, yeah, something like that. If not, it's in other policies for sure. Yeah. Okay. All right. I was caught. I was caught. So
That's okay. Please play on. I don't mind it.
that's too funny. That's too funny. How's your family doing?
I think okay. We in our second week of school, and Lydia's been going 100% full time, and so that's fantastic for her. And Lila at high school is doing the 50% in person, 50% remote. We're in Millard, so it's going okay. So it's I'm glad that I'm glad that I'm glad we're in Millard and that they can go to school in person. So,
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, my
so
my grandson, the 7-year-old, he's in first grade this year, and
mm,
so he has to go with a mask and all that stuff. And he got home after the first day, and I said, "So, what do you think about going to school with a mask? Do you like it?" And he goes, "No." I said, "Oh, that's too bad." He said, "I love it." He said, "That way, no one gets to see if I'm smiling or not." So I thought, "Oh, that is honest as you get."
yeah, that's
So
the girls haven't had any issues wearing it, and
yeah, that's good.
hey, Kate, your mic's
Hey,
not
Kate.
working out.
Yeah,
Hey,
hey, yeah, hey, someone mute Kate.
yeah,
There
somebody.
you go.
Okay,
Yeah, no, both of the girls haven't had any issues, and I've asked,
that's
I
good.
was more worried about, okay, is the teacher going to have to spend an inordinate amount of time, managing this, making sure people are keeping their masks on, and
Yeah,
they've said that their classmates are being, pretty compliant, that there's not anyone that's really stepping out of line.
yeah,
So that's
that's good.
encouraging too,
That
that,
is good.
you know,
Yeah, very much so.
they can focus on learning while they're there. So.
Cool. Very good. Very good. I went with my wife to Bed Bath and Beyond last night, and I actually it was interesting. A customer went up to another customer and said, there's a policy about wearing masks in the store, and I would ask you to keep your mask on. And she did it very nicely for the protection of me and for the protection of you. And the young kid kind of barked a little bit. Then he looked over at me and I said, "Dude, just put on your mask. You have it in your hand. Just put it on. What's the big deal?"
Yeah.
And so he put it on reluctantly, but it was kind of like, why, and maybe it's just part of the defiance of, I think he was like junior high, maybe high school, and his mom was around the corner and maybe took it off, but it was kind of like, come on, man, just put it on,
Yeah.
It's just really interesting,
Hmm.
but little bit of rum in this Malachi coconut bite drink. Actually tastes like a pina colada. Actually, no, I'm just joking.
Today's just another day at the beach, right?
Yeah, good. I'll just stop. I can't. I'll just stop.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, Eric, it's kind of Eric, consultant Eric, and Bill. It is kind of funny having a conversation with Harlan on Bill's perspective is really interesting. So having that feedback, Bill, is very interesting. So.
Well, let me ask you: is there or not what you heard me say and what he has said?
It's all good. No,
Okay.
yeah, he said you were an exceptional board member. So
Thank you.
and
He was
so
a great CEO too. Great CEO.
yeah, and he's leaving. Did they announce his replacement yet?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I don't.
Yeah, I think it's coming
September.
like
Early
September,
September.
October.
I think
Yeah.
September 8th is the special meeting that's been called to announce the new CEO.
Yeah, very good. I know in the COVID stuff, they kind of delayed that, and he agreed to stay another 6 months or so, or something like that. So
Yeah, under duress though. He's ready. He's ready to go. But he's committed to the organization. So
he is. I think when the board member joined the board, an ex-employee joined the board, he got a little more focused. I think.
yeah, well, actually, that's not the first. That's not the first time that has happened.
Oh my God.
Board. There was a former employee who was on the board. So, which
oh geez, yeah,
creates extra need for focus.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way. That's a beautiful way to say that, by the way. So.
All right, ready?
Go ahead.
Craig, do you think we're ready to get started again?
Yep, I do.
Okay. Well, so far I'm hearing we've gone through SD. Again, I'm going to call it 7.9 for lack of better words to describe it. SD2, and now I think let's go on to SD4, which is the reliability policy, and talk about kind of what people's feelings are about this one and why it might need revisiting. Again, I'll look for hands up on this one, but I'll also I have a pretty good idea from our interviews about some of the issues that surfaced around the reliability policy. So Rick, I'm going to start with you because I know you have some thoughts about this one. What again, I want you to really focus on, Rick, from your own perspective, what is it that the board needs to articulate or clarify in this policy?
Greg, you're not muted. They're muted. You stop crunching. So the board needs to better understand what the customer's view of reliability is. The definitions we have now, I don't think are a definition that a customer would have.
Say more about that, Rick. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so as I understand it, and I'll have to phone a friend in SMT, the exact definition of the SAIDI is something about a power outage over a certain amount of time is or is not related to a thunderstorm or a weather event. But customers that have talked to me have talked about reliability issues that have more to do with service breaks, frequencies on a particular circuit, which have been solved. But that's just an anecdote that shows that customers are not always thinking of those longer term SAIDI kinds of definitions. So maybe a survey of customers would help us out.
So what you're saying though, Rick, is you're not sure that the board is complete in its definition of the metrics for reliability. Is that what you're saying?
That is one aspect of that. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Are there other aspects of this that you would raise?
The other aspect I would raise is that SAIDI, CAIDI, and SAFE are the three utility metrics that are out there. We only use one. Or if you use two of those, you can back calculate the third. I don't know. I think when I have seen recommendations to utilities in reports, they recommend that you pick two. So just trying to normalize with what I'm seeing in other utilities, so that the board can judge how to other utilities. Okay. Then the last element is resiliency. Resiliency, this needs to be the place where we would articulate and define what resiliency is as either an extension of reliability or something unique. We haven't had a conversation as a board.
Thank you. Mike, is your hand up on this one?
I think it was stale, but I'm just going to add, reliability to me doesn't just include uninterrupted service, quick recovery when service does go down, but also how much easier it is nowadays for us for our customers to report outages. We've come a long ways in that regard. I've got a question for management, if this would be possible, just out of curiosity. Is there any way we could compare our current reliability with, say, what it was 25, 30 years ago, just for just to see if we've strived in that area?
So let me put that on the parking lot, Mike, as a future informational item, because
just to be curious. It wouldn't necessarily impact how we do business now, but it might just show where we stand and stuff.
Okay. Yeah. So other board members, with regard to kind of what if anything do you feel that this current SD language doesn't address, that you want to address, outcomes you want to achieve that are not identified here? So looking for hands, Craig and Eric.
If I recall, when I completed the survey, I echoed the same thing that Rick just said, which is, it seems we're talking about resiliency much more now. It was key to the power with purpose decision, and I wondered whether or not that needs to be incorporated into this SD.
Cool. Eric?
Yeah, similar comment that resiliency was used as part of the description, and with the understanding that, as staff has pointed out, there isn't a resiliency definition at SPP, and things are changing at federal regulatory perspective. So with the understanding that this is a new territory, I do think that's an area where we should stay focused, because we did use reliability and resiliency frequently during that resource planning process, even with descriptions to the public. And so if we're going to use this as part of our explanation of why things are happening, I do think we should be able to understand it more clearly.
Janice?
So I agree with everything that the others said, and not only a definition of resilience, but a metric for that. And at what point have we gotten to redundancy, and let's make sure that we're not overbuilding or overspending in our efforts to be resilient. Thank you.
Do other members want to speak to this question of what is missing or what additional outcomes you want to express here, Anne?
I might also go along and echo what other people have said about resiliency. And I do think that needs to be added to this. We've had before, when we were looking at this, we did look at CAIDI, and I'm not quite sure why we decided not to use CAIDI, that they thought that SAIDI was just sufficient, but that could go back into the conversation too at a later date.
Okay. Anyone else?
All right. Yep, I'll add in. I also agree that resiliency needs to be covered or added to this SD, and perhaps the metrics are related to the knee curve that we all became familiar with during Power with Purpose, although that wasn't made publicly available. So we'll need to figure out what information can be shared publicly but getting us to that same type of level of detail and guidepost for decision making.
Cool. Tim, is there anything you want to add to this discussion before we keep going?
No, not really. I think as you'll see in Troy's, some of you have had conversation with Troy. We're trying to get to some of that level of detail without having necessarily, to Amanda's point, there's some things we don't necessarily want to talk about the knee curve in the public and all the other pieces around it, but certainly talk about what we're doing around reliability and circuits and programs and those kinds of things. And we've asked Troy to go out and do a one-on-one with you on some of those, but I don't see any concerns with that. We'll just have to, define the resiliency and whether it's the definition that we use in Power with Purpose, or if NERC, FERC, or others, SPP have a definition that's forthcoming, how we incorporate that into this.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
I
so
think just one more thing. Sorry, I think that when we talk about resiliency, there's the potential of gold plating the system, and so I think that our SD needs to find that balance where we're not gold plating the system, but we're doing what's appropriate for our customers.
And what do you mean by gold plating, Amanda?
I think the overinvestment of things to ensure that the system can respond to an impact of some magnitude. From our Power with Purpose conversations, as I recall, we can go to the nth degree with those types of things, but that kind of level is not always necessary. And so finding the right balance of what's needed to keep the level of power quality up. I'll stop there because I feel like I'm out of my boundary of comfort level with terms. Yep. So.
Okay. Well, so I think we've heard the reasons why board members would like to revisit SD4. So I'm going to move on to the next one, which I think would be SD11. I'm just kind of going in order now, which I believe is the economic development SD. So with regard to SD11, again, this one, now we're into the policies that received fewer mentions in terms of being high priorities for a rework.
Eric, sorry, if it's possible to redirect, SD13 was one that had a higher level of.
At a higher level, okay.
Yeah.
Then let's go to SD13. So SD13, with regard to this this SD, again, question: why would each of you want to open this one up? What is it that you feel is not articulated in terms of desired impacts? I look for hands. If I see no hands, I'll just randomly call on somebody. Well, Craig, let me start with you on this one. So as you look at SD13, can you identify kind of an area where you feel that the board needs to be more clear or precise in this policy?
I can't say that I do.
All right. So looking for hands then, people who feel like this SD13 needs to be revisited and why. So Rick, I see your hand up, and I see Amanda, your hand literally just right? So Rick and then Amanda.
Yeah, today we have heard.
You're breaking up a little bit.
Hang on, let me. Sometimes stopping my video helps with that. Let me know if I continue to break up, and I'll defer to someone else who wants to talk.
You're good.
Okay, thank you. SD13, I think is we CEO today that in the discussion of resource planning that there's an opportunity to improve communication that goes along with resource planning, and I think at about a timing of what we would put into SD 13 with her. I would add language, you know, at the high level, the what OPPD would be the first and best source of information about OPPD. I think kind of or kind of parallel activities are necessary in management. That should occur starting about the same time that we're doing the engineering planning of big projects. So that is back to that timing thing. And engagement requires more than just telling people what OPPD do. I would like to get meaningful feedback from stakeholders.
So,
Two is a rubric that is being used more, but I think there's still an opportunity for improvement. How I would articulate that in the OPPD shall, I don't have a bullet language for you.
so what I'm hearing you say, Rick, is that, again, being the first and best source of information for stakeholders and consumers and customers about OPPD, that's a potential way to clarify and further articulate this directive. I also hear you saying, you know, wanting to be proactive in the way, in the timing with which we engage stakeholders. And then I think the hollow bullet, first one obviously says provide meaningful ways. And so perhaps just being more clear on how management would interpret that might be something we would want a conversation about. Other board members? You're welcome. Other board members? I see Eric, your hand is up.
Yeah, we've mentioned the relationship between resource planning and the customer engagement. I think that's important. We also have some other types of strategic planning processes that are not specifically resource planning or an integrated resource plan. The Strategic Vision 2050 is ongoing, and the Strategic Initiative Decarbonization. And so clarifying how we are doing that customer engagement and some of the expectations, I think would be appreciated. As Rick mentioned, the increased use of
hold on, Eric, hold on one second. So as we said earlier, one set of questions would be for you to ask management, how are you interpreting our SD to help us understand kind of how you plan to, and so that would be one aspect of what I'm hearing you say. But the question on the table today, I think, really is also not just about the information you're asking for management, but is there something in the SD itself that you think needs to be clarified?
Yeah, I apologize. I was trying to set some background, but yes, getting to in this SD, there are not metrics specifically targeted at outcomes. And so I think that in some of our discussion in the past, the difference between, and Rick is the one who generally mentions this, the difference between activities and outcomes and how those are measured, I think is important. I think that's an area where a clarification would be beneficial here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Erica, can I just do a follow-up with the other Eric? Help me understand what you believe are outcomes from this strategic directive, Eric.
Well, I guess I'm not clear what the answer would be on the outcomes here, but I do think that an outcome-based metric is an important way to clarify what we're looking toward, rather than a tallying of activities. And so I'm sorry, I don't have a specific answer right now. I just feel like that is a directional improvement in the policy that could be made, so that when we have the understanding of the monitoring report and what we would expect to see, that we know more clearly how will this be judged as far as sufficiently compliant. And so I think that the PI committee working on what are the metrics that can help us understand the outcome-based success, I think that's something that the committee should work through. I'm sorry, I don't have a clear answer on what that should be now. But in reading this language and looking at some others, in a lot of the others, you know, debt coverage 2.0, that kind of stuff. I mean, there are more specific thumbs up, thumbs down types of things, and this one lacks some of the specificity in whether or not the outcome is achieved.
So I want to put some other hands here. So Anne, you have your hand up, and then Amanda, and I think Craig, you have your hand. So Anne?
Yeah, I think trying to figure out outcomes for stakeholder process is a little difficult because each type of things that they do is very, very different. So I think it has been a difficult answer. We've asked for outcomes from them multiple times, and instead they do give wonderful reports, and they also give people's responses and show us the responses. I think that the information management people have done and have been done an amazing job, and we are leaders in this. But I think the problem is, I don't know how you're going to define these outcomes, these metrics. I think it's very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I like it the way it's said right now. I think it's broad enough. I think it needs to be broad enough. So as we do so many different types of stakeholder processes, it covers it all.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. So Amanda, I think you're next.
Okay, so the way that I look at the strategic directives at times is aspirational. And I'm wondering if the metric could simply be to eventually be named the Organization of the Year by IAP2. They have an award for Organization of the Year for core value. It's a core values award. And I'm looking at the application. It's very detailed and intense, but I think that there might be some things that we can pull out of that, tease out of that might be interesting to include here. That's very much a what we want. We want OPPD to achieve this level of performance.
Or another way to say it would be leadership or something like that. So it's not tied to a specific award, right? Craig? Craig, your hand is up and you're muted. Craig, you're muted.
Yep. I had a chat going, so sorry. I think all I'm doing is echoing Ann's comment. We've talked about having a metric for SD13 for quite a while. I don't know that what Amanda just proposed, I don't know anything about it, so maybe that's the silver bullet. But thinking about it on a project by project basis, I think is more interesting. And maybe, and again, I don't know, but for the sake of discussion, it has reminiscent characteristics to the affordability discussion that we've had over the years, where we didn't have a metric at first, and so we put in the SD, let's start to think about and track affordability metrics. Maybe the same thing makes sense here, where we more deliberately say, let's start working towards something, not knowing what it is just yet.
Okay. So I see some hands up. I want to make sure that they're not stale hands. So I think Janice, your hand is up, and maybe Rick, you have your hand up again. So Janice?
Yeah, so I just wondered if, in the context of SD9 and that if we could put some goalposts in this SD related to resource planning, and for example, if a project meets certain criteria for long-term impact, that we would expect an integrated engagement process around that project, and just putting some goalposts on there.
So what would be a goalpost example, Janice?
And kind of like what Rick said, is when we start doing the engineering evaluation on a project that would meet those long-term criteria, that would automatically trigger an integrated engagement process.
So what you would add would be something around when OPPD engages in resource planning initiatives, that will trigger a stakeholder engagement process or something like that.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And then I think Rick, your hand is up.
I think that outcomes can be defined for this. Maybe because I have an engineering background, I'm unable to articulate that to the confidence of anyone around us. maybe there's an opportunity for some training for board members, or some outside expert coming in to help us with that. That might be a step. I kind of agree with Moody that that this will be an evolving process. But I'm confident that we can find some outcome measures that will help us be able to successfully monitor the activities as achieving goals that need to be set for the efforts.
So, okay, so let's go ahead and look at a couple of more policies, and then we'll try to do some prioritization around these. So,
Hey, Eric. Hey, Eric. I think also I just have to add this, but I think on the, it is, we do use the IAP2 as we go into different projects, whether it's a transmission project, whether it's rates, whether it's even power with purpose. Not all stakeholder engagement, even based on that matrix, is we take feedback and we use the feedback in the decision. Not all the time. And so there are elements of it that we begin to vet internally. Now, I would say maybe we can do a better job of sharing on the front end to what level we plan on using in the IAP2, just for that clarity and for that conversation on the front end. So at least the expectations are either known from the board to the senior management team, and how we can execute that maybe better in the process. So I'll take that piece of it. So
cool. So let's go ahead and look at BL5 next. BL5 was another policy that got the highest level of disagree. So BL5 is the unity of control policy. And of course, we talked about this yesterday. And so I'm not sure whether this is a question of revisiting and revising the policy, or just clarifying the meaning behind the policy. So would somebody like to, and Rick, I don't know if that's a stale hand or a real hand you have up there. So if it's a real hand, feel free to leave it up. So, but the question is, now what is it that we want to do with regard to articulating in this policy that perhaps is not clear in it today? So board members, what is it when you think about trying to clarify this? Or Scott, perhaps you can remind us what the comments were around this, just so that we can be clear on kind of what the direction was that the comments were pointing us toward.
I am looking, so if anybody wants to start from the board, then I can refresh.
Craig, I see your hand go up, and while Scott's looking, perhaps you can.
Yeah, now that I'm reading it, I wasn't sure at first, but now as I'm reading it, I think maybe I asked the question on the third bullet, whether it's really what I think we want and or expect or need, whether or not directors have full and open access to senior management and other OPPD employees. I mean, that implies to me that I can pretty much pick up the phone and call any OPPD employee at my leisure. And I'm not necessarily sure that that's a good idea. So that might be, I know that I made that comment. I'm not sure if I had other comments with respect to why this policy might need a revision, but I know that that was one of them.
Well, Tim, I don't know if you have, Tim Burke, I don't know if you want to comment on this at all, or speak to the value that's expressed here in this third bullet with regard to directors having full and open access to senior management and other OPPD employees to ask questions and receive information.
Thanks, Eric. I appreciate that. I mean, I think we operate today where if anybody in the finance committee has a question of Javier, or anybody on the board has a question on Javier in a specific area that he focuses on, finance, let's say, or material management or energy marketing, they have access to give him a call or send him an email and have that conversation. I think that's good. I think to Craig's point, that's a really good point. I don't think we've had significant issues around that. There has been times where folks have kind of moved to that director level because they either have a relationship or previously or whatever that may be. But I really think it is, to Craig's point, better to be at either the CEO or the senior management level, and with a note back to the CEO to say, hey, I've engaged Javier on this topic. Just want to let you know about that so I can hold Javier accountable, or go back to the board member and say, wait a minute, we're not going to go down that path, and here's the reasons why we're not going to do that.
Thank you, Tim. I will just share that in other boards that we work with, it's not framed quite as broadly as you framed it here, Craig, the kind of an answer to your question. It is framed more tightly around open access to senior management, and with a expectation that requests of senior management be CC'd to the CEO, since you direct the organization through the CEO. So it is broad. Again, I'm not suggesting you change it, but I'm just wanting to share that fact with you. Other members' thoughts on this policy? Scott, I don't know if you've been able to find the comments and whether there are other comments that board members made.
I have, and I've directed people to where they can see their comments with the thought that if they had a preference to kind of provide insight into their comments and the disagreement, that might be the best way of approaching those comments.
And you've done that through the chat, or where have you done that?
Through the chat, yeah. Or
I'm not seeing that.
I could just read them aloud. Yeah, well, it says, one comment says, we have an extremely engaged board of directors. There's concern about micromanaging of individuals or committees as a potential problem. That's one nature of the discussion. And the other one was really a tension that's revealed through this and how the board goes about getting information.
Mm-hmm. So both of which comments are clearly about how this policy gets implemented and fully realized, right? They're not about, is the policy language needing an update? And we did talk about this yesterday.
It may simply be that, Eric, that there's nothing more to discuss other than to just acknowledge that there was a level of disagreement around this, but perhaps refinement is not the way it's resolved.
Right. I do want to mention one other policy, and if we could go back to.
I'm sorry, Eric. Before we jump, I apologize. On this one, I think we talked about it quite a bit yesterday, and I think that covered a lot of what I remember from my comments on the survey about how the unity of control is expressed and how committees work. And so I think that the discussion we had yesterday was pretty close to this particular topic. So I'm not sure if we have notes there that would be relevant to bring in for potential consideration of clarification here. I don't remember action items. Do you remember from your notes from yesterday if you had interpreted action items on policy from unity of control that we needed to take? I don't remember.
The only action item that we discussed was a revision to the fourth bullet, if you recall, Eric. We introduced language there with regard to, the SMUD language example for around formally or informally evaluating staff. That was the second facet of our conversation about this. Yep. First facet being just being clear about what it means.
Right, and so the discussion yesterday about if a committee is asking for particular background work to be done that would lead to an item that would become a vote, I'm not sure if any clarification is necessary here on how a committee helps to facilitate getting to something prior to it becoming a voting action, or if a policy change is necessary there. I don't feel like it's inherently obvious, but just something that we didn't talk about yesterday.
Oh, I think that's where we talked about the board work plan. And I think that the whole board work plan process was the one in which I think you and other board members expressed a great deal of excitement about how using that more specific format of board identified priorities, et cetera, parking lot items would help clarify what things have risen to the level of work.
And then do you feel that any language here is necessary relevant to that, or is that just something that's been discussed here and understood and implemented that feels like an interpretation question? Are we clear enough that that is the action step that we'll take, or does any change need to reflect that?
Good question. Let's go to GP4 for a second, Mo. So GP4 is the policy where you describe your work plan, Eric. And so in the first preamble of this, and in the first bullet, it talks about how you'll develop a planning process that ensures you focus on the things that you want to focus on. Each year, develop an annual work plan comprised of the topics. And then the rest of this, it goes into more agenda planning versus the work plan itself. But that first bullet point is the place where the level of specificity that the board has currently articulated is contained.
And as we talked about yesterday, the board gets to see the accomplishments for the year of that committee charter, their committee charter, and then the next year committee charter activities. And I think what we've talked about doing is not just that, but the board activity and the monitoring reports, and maybe both district-wide and strategic initiative related work kind of combined together to create really a robust plan that the board then gets to see kind of all of those activities laid out over the course of the year in the calendar. So you know what at least we are anticipating bringing to the board at what time and what that may look like. Again, we'll.
And we talked about adding a tab on committee updates too, Tim, as I recall. So that was another discussion item yesterday. I believe the specific to-do coming out of yesterday's conversation was that, led by Scott Foch, you were going to look at a revised template for the work plan and see whether that meets
Yes,
the needs of the board.
that's correct, and make sure that we're able to continue forth with, we have the current work plan that's not necessarily a board driven thing, it's a management driven thing, but make sure that we're able to establish something so that it allows us to take the input from the board, and which should be part of that work plan as well.
So we do have notes on this, and we will include that in our synopsis of the workshop, both workshops. So I don't know, Scott, if there are other policies that you think that we should be looking at. SD11 was one that came up on our interviews as one that people felt some energy around potentially revising. So
that would be a great one to go to, and it falls into the next category where it did have two disagree or strongly disagrees.
So I think this will be the last one, though, that we want to look at before we take some time to try to prioritize and figure out next steps. So with regard to economic development, I see some hands up. Those may be stale hands, or those may be real hands. If those are stale hands, you can take them down. With regard to this one, what are board members' comments as to what's missing here? What do you need to articulate that's not currently being articulated? Okay, is this a real hand up?
That's okay.
Okay.
The question, or the two elements that I think are necessary here, just as we ask for some kind of cost effectiveness testing on the efficiency investments, I think it's useful to have some kind of ROI or cost effectiveness development investment we make. So that element. The second element is 99% of the jobs in Nebraska, I don't know about in the OPPD service area, but in Nebraska, 99% of the jobs are with small businesses. So I would see investment in economic development towards where most of the economic activity happens. And I right now heard that that's reflected in what is being reported to the board. So, and then the thing, I guess I'll add one more just because conversation again just last month, energy efficiency, any way that we can help customers reduce the amount of money that they give to OPPD, more money that then goes into the economy. So that would be item, I think, or a valuable item to emphasize.
Other
1, 2,
thoughts
3.
here, Eric?
Yeah, Scott Foch, appreciate you reminding us to look at the comments we had previously submitted. I see my own. And Eric, I'm not sure if you want us to rehash things that we had already written, but I do see now that I had also echoed something about recognizing the benefit to businesses from helping them to reduce their energy cost. And I've talked back and forth during finance reports about this in the past, that weather fluctuations are one thing, but by facilitating reduction in energy use, that is, you know, it's not an economic development as in plus, but it's reducing what is to a business an expense. So reducing their negative part of their bottom line. And I'm not sure if we have a way to document how we're helping achieve that outcome. And I think I highlighted this is not a top priority, which we're going to go to prioritization, but helping to reduce the cost in ways that aren't adjusting of rates, but rather helping essentially energy efficiency. And maybe that even does extend to distributed generation if businesses are interested in reducing their energy cost by producing some of their own energy on site. How do we measure those economic impacts, which are outside of the realm of either our production, distribution, sale of energy to the businesses?
Okay, any other comments on SD11? Seeing none. Craig, my thought was in terms of prioritizing which of these all to look at, we would first just make sure people are we recap the list of potential candidates for the work plan. So if we were to take everything that people have talked about today and put them on the work plan, it would include SD9/SD7. It would include SD2, the rates policy. It would include SD4, the reliability policy. It would include SD11, your economic development policy, SD13, your stakeholder policy, as well as BL5, the unity of control. Then from yesterday, I just want to have you recall that we talked about a potential change to BL7, which was the policy that tells that describes the conditions under which the CEO provides communication back to the board. So Craig, I just want to check my list against your list to make sure I'm not missing anything or anybody else who's keeping score here.
Yeah, that's the same list that I have. I guess I would, I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of other potential action items from yesterday that aren't necessarily policy changes, but are a use of resources that would affect our ability to change policies. So the work plan issue, and I'm connecting that to GP4 at least a little bit because that first bullet really specifically talks about annual work plan development, and I think what we described yesterday was an ongoing work plan. So that's one, and that's going to take some time, but I think we can knock that out fairly quickly. Then there's this kind of open-ended question that we never really got to yesterday, which was around how can we operationalize the board as a unit in engaging its customer owners. Right. We discussed it. I can't say that we have a good plan of action for it, so I'm not sure if that really will or needs to go anywhere, but those are things that I have on my mind as well in terms of potential next steps.
Yep. And the policies that I have written down on my list that relate to that are GP2 and GP3, where it really describes your role in stakeholder engagement.
Yeah. Okay.
So I had those on my list as well.
Okay.
So I think one way to just initially kind of get a sense of prioritization, it won't be the only way, would be to use the chat. And I assume everybody can get to the chat. And just to everyone, if you had only one, going back, and I don't think we necessarily have to pick just one, but if you had only one of these to work on in the coming year, which one would it be? And again, I'm hoping everybody's been keeping notes on this list. So again, just to recap, the SD7, SD9 discussion around both resource planning, environmental leadership. I guess we try to frame that around kind of how can you speak to the broader energy leadership and market leadership you want to display. SD2 on rates, SD4 on reliability, SD11 on economic development, SD13 with regard to stakeholder engagement. And then with regard to the BLs, BL5, the unity of control, BL7, the delegation to the CEO, and then GP4, the work plan, and GP2 and 3, which really speak to your stakeholder role as a board. So I just did in the chat, if you could just do one, just for the exercise of just picking one, I would appreciate each board member just saying, if only one, what would it be? I see a couple of responses already. I see 3 responses. Other board members wish to opine on, there we go, Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think at this point we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 members who, Tim Gay, of course, isn't here. So let's assume that this exercise has revealed that the top priorities are SD9, the resource planning, and the SD2 rates discussion. So I think those 2 things, then Craig, if again I can keep turning to you as chair, those feel to me like already then board identified priorities for the coming year. So I think everything else now has to be put in the context of, well, how much resources and time and energy are going to be required given everything else you have on your plate to address those, and then what more could you add to the list?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think you hit on one thing that's important. I think some of these may require more time, energy, deliberation, resources needed to start to work through them, and others might not take a whole lot, right? If it's just cleaning up something that we think is just inaccurate with respect to how we function. There's a vote for SD4 right there. So that, I guess, I think there's a reasonably objective way that we can look at that and prioritize the remaining ones based on, SD2 rates is a good example of one where, in my view, I think, and this is kind of what Janice said, because of the timeline, we got to change it. We can't just let that linger because we don't have time. So if there are others that really are pressing, and we have to prioritize it, and then it's a question of how much capacity do we have for those others that don't have that pressing nature to them.
Well, would you put, so Craig, would you put GP4 and kind of just refinements around this work plan process as something that requires, quote, cleanup, and therefore might be something that gets added here, that because it's not so resource intensive, might be something you could also tackle in the coming year?
I honestly think that GP4 is a good example of one where I could take 5 minutes after we're done here and rewrite a bullet, bring it to governance in September, and we're done.
Okay.
Yeah. So those are the ones where if it's super simple, straightforward, if it's not consequential, if it's just reflecting the way that we do business today, I don't want to just punt those just because they don't have priorities. If it's something that I can just kind of handle and move through whatever committee, that's fine.
So I saw at least one colleague applauding that decision.
Yeah, I think the change in the SD takes a short period of time. I think there's an integration piece that I don't think is significant, although Mo just probably fell over and, but it's that integration piece on how, just from a timing perspective and how we put it together and how we organize it and then how we review it. I think those are the elements that we'll just, I think we can begin to work on that between Scott, I, and Mo and figure out what that looks like, come back to the governance committee and that executional piece of that SD change.
You mean the GP, right? You mean GP4, correct?
I mean GP4, yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't mean to minimize the operationalization of it, Tim.
Yeah, thanks.
Right.
Thanks.
Now, the other one that I think could be done relatively easily that we talked about yesterday is the change to BL7 that talked about additional circumstances under which the board would like to see communication from the CEO. And I heard everybody yesterday agree that that was a good change to make. And so if you can go down just a little bit, Mo, in the on the slide there. Yeah, it's that bullet that is the second bullet from the bottom that we talked about yesterday, doing a potential change to. So, Craig, again to you. I don't know if this is just as simple as kind of bringing this to a committee for discussion of including the language from SMUD or some version of the language from SMUD, or whether you think this requires substantially more work, but I'd be curious to know your thoughts.
It's my interpretation that it doesn't, but I just saw Eric's hand go up, so I'd be interested in his thoughts. Eric, I assume that's what your hand up is for?
He's waving off.
Sorry. Nope, waving off. I had an unrelated question. I'll circle back.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm just trying to recall the conversation from yesterday. But if it wasn't true, if it is in fact true that there was pretty good consensus around, yep, that makes sense. I'm gonna want to talk to Tim Burke about, I mean, because that's a clear action item for him. But yeah, that should be fairly straightforward.
Mm-hmm. I believe there was consensus yesterday, and I can, without showing you the language, I can basically say it was just an additional list of situations, including when the CEO believes it proposes a risk to OPPD's reputation, yep, or a reasonable risk with regard to there were just a list of things there, as you recall. Mm-hmm. You might want to look at adding. So I would put this in the list of reasonably easy to do. So you could add them to your work plan, Craig, without much additional work and resources being required.
Yep.
So now we get into the big ones, though. So SD4, for example, adding talking about and trying to get clarity around the meaning of resiliency, and I believe that was really the key point that people were trying to make here. Like, where does resiliency end, and what is the metric we attach to it? That was really the kind of the key to our discussion around SD4. But that sounds like it. Again, I would turn maybe to you, Tim Burke, and ask you, kind of, as you listen to the conversation about SD4 and the desire by almost all board members to look at kind of what do we mean by resiliency, how much work, how does that strike you as being on the scale of work for the year ahead?
Yeah, so I think part of the conversation we've had at Vision 2050 is begin to define some of these. So the senior management team has kind of bitten off some early discussions around definitions around what resiliency is. Again, there's this executional piece about, is it loss of load hours? What does that look like? And knee curve and some of the things that Amanda and others have talked about here. I would say it's probably within the framework of, we have base information on it. And I would look at, primarily in this example, it was driven to Troy on the T&D side, on the transmission side, and Mary on the generation side, a little bit to begin to think about what that looks like. I think their teams have done a lot of work around this, and I think management feels comfortable with it. It's now kind of bringing that to the board to say, hey, what does that look like? And how would we frame it in that reliability SD? I think the other thing that Rick talked about in this too was a couple metrics, not just SAIDI, but maybe SAFE or MAFE or whatever the other metrics are that may be comparable to other utilities. And then also this customer perspective, which we do talk about in the customer sat piece. We share that from a JD Power side on customers' feedback around reliability. But that is something that I would say, the team probably has a good sense of what that may look like.
So, Craig, putting that together in terms of the work plan for the board, it sounds to me that Tim is saying, some work is already being done and could be done to try to clarify what is meant by resiliency, and maybe some additional metrics in SD4.
Mm-hmm.
Again, does that get added to the board identified priorities? There was certainly a broad consensus amongst your colleagues that this is an important one to get an update to.
Yeah, I guess my take is that the these conversations don't strike me as ones that will be sort of foundational to a different vision, which means that I think they'd likely be a little bit easier and efficient. So I guess my inclination would be to put SD4, that's systems committee, right? If I remember correctly. So to send that to systems and give them, and we could pull the plug if we find out that this is going to be a massive amount of time and energy. So you give it to systems, give them 30 minutes to start working through it, and then make kind of a go no go decision from there as to whether or not it needs to be further vetted out.
I haven't got any text from my senior team at this point, so we may be okay. But as we get into it, I mean, this thing could unfold a little bit. Depends on how deep it is. So to me, it's more of a clarification and refinement versus it's got to be a rewrite. Now, the resiliency conversation that we had around redundancy and gold plating, to me, those are deeper conversations that I think could be vetted out over a period of time.
Yeah, Janice has got her hand up, though. She's chair of the systems committee, so I'm interested in her perspective.
Janice? Janice, you're muted.
I'm thinking that maybe the resilience piece can be part of the SD9 discussion, perhaps, beginning. But when I talked to Mary about that, there's kind of a feeling that we need to wait until we get, and I know we want to be leading the way on these, but, things above us, like SPP and even up to FERC, are working on definitions of resiliency. And so some of that work will be done for us, I think, as we wait for that. So perhaps the resilience one, and yes, this could go to us for adding to the systems committee for adding additional metrics. But I think the whole resiliency piece is part of a bigger discussion.
So we're trying to sum up where I think this is all headed. There's enough energy around trying to be clear about resiliency that it should be added to the work plan, the timing of which, again, Craig, would be up to you as you go through the course of the year and try to figure out what takes precedence over what.
Okay.
So that leaves off the plate so far for the board identified work priorities, SD 13, stakeholder engagement, and it also leaves off the plate so far sort of the discussion of how to operationalize the role of the board in stakeholder engagement. So based on the discussions we had yesterday, as well as today, and based on the interviews we conducted, we know this is a place where the board really wants to get clarity. Greg, I don't know if you have a specific idea, or Kim Burke, a specific idea on kind of what actions could be added to the work plan in terms of helping to advance this issue or this clarity we're looking for. Curious if people have thoughts.
Well, I'm not muted, am I? Nope.
You're fine.
So on 11, I'm inclined to put that in the parking lot. I mean, we heard from Director Yoder and Williams that there are a couple opportunities to improve them. Mm-hmm. But my hunch is that they're not as pressing as these others. So I think we need I would put them on the parking lot for now, and then when it's appropriate to pull them off, then we do that. Mm-hmm. So that's 11. 13, maybe, perhaps, probably the same. Again, good comments, and I think there are some potential improvements, but just in the interest of trying to prioritize and organize our work a little bit, I think that would be the proper place for it. That's the only one where I kind of waffle a little bit, because I think that's PI committee, if I remember correctly. And I don't know that the PI committee has a significant workload coming out of this, but PI also needs to get that legislative resolution done. So I don't want to put too much on the PI committee right now. So that's where my gut is.
Anybody want to take issue with kind of putting those two on the parking lot for now? I mean, obviously, as this work planning process goes forward, you'll have a chance to regularly look at the things on the parking lot and make the case for moving them off the parking lot onto the board identified priorities.
So from my hand raise and wave off earlier, I wanted, and then the thing I wanted to get to was that point about SD13 on operationalize the board and the stakeholder engagement process. I would suggest maybe trying to bump that up, only because as we look to next year, we have some very major things that are scheduled to be occurring with the integrated resource plan process, the SV 2050, the decarbonization. All three of those things are ongoing in 2021. And so this is an item that we had discussed last year. PI had taken a look at a policy on board engagement and how and when is a board member acting in an official capacity with the organization, but we didn't get to a policy update resolution since last year. And so looking into 2021, I would encourage that this be something we try and come up with a way to clarify, because of the work that is scheduled for the near future.
That's a great comment, Eric. I appreciate you flagging that. Are there policy implications for this one beyond any way in which it would fall into SD 13? And I don't even know if that's right, but I don't remember, Eric, if there was a specific BL or GP that would require some changes in order to take some meaningful steps on how this might look.
I mean, I think in your BLs, you have probably delegate. I can't speak to them exactly, and I'm sorry, I can't, Craig. But there may be a delegation to the CEO with regard to stakeholder communication and stakeholder engagement that would need to be looked at in concert with this.
Yeah.
But the primary ones to look at here would be GP2 and GP3, because that is defining the board's role. The SDs are obviously defining your direction to the CEO. So that's where you're saying, here's what we want the CEO to do. I'm imagining that there's also something in the BLs that says we also delegate to the CEO responsibility for keeping our customers and our ratepayers informed about the actions and activities of OPPD. So all of those things dovetail together. I'm sensitive to what Eric is saying, though, which is that we've got stuff coming up on our plates that's going to require us to have clarity about our role as a board in helping, in being a contributor and being an advancing stakeholder engagement. And so I hear that.
Yeah, Eric, I would say that GP7 also would fall in that category along with 2 and 3.
Of course, GP7 sort of circumscribes the
right.
the roles of the board.
And Eric, you mentioned 2 and 3. In 3, the top bullet as representative of the customer owners and build relationships, I feel is a good statement about the potential for engagement here. And I'd be interested if there's a way to provide clarification under that bullet point, if it doesn't require policy review and update, but if there is a clarification of understanding about how that works that is appropriate under the existing language, I think that would also be a fine way to make sure we handle this. But it is an item that we talked about last year, and again, I don't know if bullet point update or metric change is appropriate. Feels like probably the GP area is where this is most effectively addressed.
I agree. And by the way,
and then operationally, Eric Williams, this is kind of the Eric Williams, and then operationally, I think it would behoove kind of Lisa and I to begin to think about, as we begin to roll out those stakeholder events and processes for strategic initiative, for integrated resource plan, for whatever the form may be, it would behoove us to begin to lay out what that plan and strategy in the work plan, so the board understands where that stakeholder process will be engaged and can be engaged with the board on, if that makes sense.
Yep. Rick's got his hand up.
Does Rick have something to say on this one? Rick, you're breaking up again. Maybe you can turn off your video, and that way we can hear exactly what you want to say.
I want to let this for the conversation come to an end on the members' role in public engagement. And so my hand is for how stakeholder outreach SD13 would relate to the SD9 activity. Let's not forget of SD9 I think.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. I guess maybe now is the time to have a conversation about whether or not an ad hoc committee makes sense to dig into SD9 because of that. Right. And as I said, I think in a chat yesterday, it's August, and I'm a little bit concerned about the turnover of committees again and new board members going into 2021 and just kind of hitting a road bump again there. So I'm wondering, any thoughts on whether or not an ad hoc would make sense to dig into SD9 so that we ensure that we've got somebody to stick with it?
Are you looking for volunteers, or are you looking for thoughts as to kind of whether that's the appropriate thing to do?
Yeah, well, the latter first, and certainly both, but the latter first to be sure.
It would certainly be in keeping with other boards we work with, Craig, that an ad hoc around this whole area of the board's role in stakeholder engagement, the SD13 itself, the role of the boards in engagement with regard to resource planning, all of that could be the subject of an ad hoc that's trying to come back with recommendations to the board.
So could we roll 13 and 9 together there, or is that too much for them to chew on?
If the answer is, hey, we're going to get rid of 9, but in 13 we're going to add that there will be a defined stakeholder process for integrated resource prior to integrated resource plan approval by the OPPD board of directors or something like that. I mean, that's one of them where I get rid of that, and if that's the nucleus of what the board has interest in, then let's think about that. That's what I would say. Get rid of something if you need to add it into something else to strengthen it. And I would say from our work plan piece, this is something that we could begin to roll into the work plan to come back and share with the board, because I don't think all this is going to be done between now and the end of the year with all the other things that have going on. So this is kind of like over the next year of work, and how does that incorporate into the broader work that the board and the senior management team is engaged in, and then the board can weigh in on, hey, this has got to be a higher priority than where you have it in the schedule, and then we just have to go what leaves, because we already have a full deck that we're laying out on strategic initiatives and power with purpose execution and ongoing stakeholder process with that. So
if I might add, I'm not sure that the constraints of existing policy SD9, SD13 is the best way of even looking at it, because there was all of this conversation as we were going through this around the electrification, distribution, innovation. It might be that it's a new policy, so I think it's important to consider a charter for an ad hoc committee that doesn't necessarily tie it to an existing policy, but that's one of the considerations that it would be taking to figure out what the best approach to policy is to solve for all of these different existing parts.
So we started here with SD13, and it sounded like we were talking about ad hoc on the engagement components related to resource planning. I think there are engagement activities that are not specific to resource planning that are also important to keep in mind, but that branched backward over into the other aspects of SD9, not between either staff and the public, staff management and the public, or the board and the public, but as Scott said, with the resource transformation component. Craig, I think that since that was prioritized, when we started talking through prioritization, can you remind me what you said at the beginning of the prioritization discussion about our expected work on SD9? I apologize if I missed what you had indicated our next steps were on that one.
Well, I think that was the one that got the most votes, so it seemed to be our priority in terms of board work and what we wanted to work on. And exactly what the timeline would be and what that would look like, I think, is open. I wasn't imagining an ad hoc just to think about the public engagement component of SD9. I think it's looking at SD9 and this question of we've got resource planning here, we've got market transformation, or however we want to define that other thing. Like, to me, an ad hoc committee needs to start chewing on that. But I don't know what a reasonable expectation would be for that. Given that we've got, IRP coming up in 2021, if I remember correctly. So like that's perhaps maybe the next conversation that somebody needs to have. I don't know who the right body is to have that, but in putting the work plan together, maybe what Tim was doing was saying that's something that they would do, is think about how all of these things fit together so that we can sequence them in the right way.
If I could just make a recommendation, Craig, just real quickly, based on what I'm hearing the board say, an ad hoc to look at, call it market transformation, call it whatever policy you want to say around the things that you want to make sure are spelled out with regard to the future investments that OPPD makes. That feels like a good subject of an ad hoc to me, and it's a kind of a classic case where an ad hoc can be very effective. So we can put on a parking lot for a moment, like who's going to be on that ad hoc. It also sounded to me like your CEO was saying, look, we get the GP2 and GP3 bullets. We understand that there's a role for the board to play here. And so one of the things on the work plan could simply be, regular, whether it's monthly or quarterly updates from the CEO on ways in which the board can be engaged in stakeholder engagement. And as you have those conversations and share that information, provide feedback with regard to the stakeholder outreach plan and see whether that meets the board's needs with regard to stakeholder engagement. If it doesn't, then you have the opportunity to go back and revisit your SD policy or the GP policies to further spell it out. It sounded like there was already kind of a marriage of minds in terms of what the importance of that engagement by board members is. So that would be my suggestion. An information, in other words, a regular information item from the CEO with regards to SMT, and then an additional ad hoc looking particularly at the contours of a potential new policy, taking the bones of SD9 and transforming it.
Yeah, well, and yes, and I'm really sensitive to the work that we have in front of us, and especially the teams that will be involved in any of that work, and the extent to which we're going to overload them with even more. Like we that's not something we should do. I think we need to make sure that we as a board are thinking critically about, like, to think about it super bluntly, right? Like, we need to make sure part of our job is to help think about where are we allocating the resources at the right time in the right place. And we've got a lot going on and a lot coming up. So I think that's why I hesitate. I'm definitely not in a position to commit at this point to saying we need to get SD9 done by time X. I think that needs to be laid over and compared to and considered alongside everything else that we've got going on. I get that it's important. I know we've been working on it since last year, but I don't want to sacrifice a bunch of other things, in my view, just because we think it's a huge priority right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So as we get towards the end of today's workshop and try to wrap up, I mean, where there's real clarity is around the priorities for the board. Again, the timing isn't necessarily clear, but SD2, SD4, again, I think there's clarity that SD9 is a top priority. Again, it's just a matter of timing, correct? And then SD11 goes to the parking lot. This question around stakeholder engagement is at this point a little unclear. I suggested one way to approach that, and then some easy fixes to GP4 and BL7 that, Craig, you're going to take the leadership on in order to effectuate.
Craig, can I ask a question there? You mentioned the other activities that are coming up, and we've talked about Strategic Vision 2050 and the decarb. Those are generally mostly information items to the board and don't require a lot of board involvement and policy setting. So I'm curious if there's another way to help with the policy update work if the constraint that we're concerned about is staff time and availability, management time and availability. this doesn't really I mean, if saying that we don't have the capacity for policy updating is based on other staff related work, that leaves, quite frankly, less for the board to do on policy updating. And I'm curious how we can still carry that forward.
Yeah, so am I. So am I. Yep, I think that's a great question, but I'll be honest and tell you that I don't have a really vivid appreciation for after the board provides direction to senior management to do X, the volume of activity that happens, once we walk out of the room. So to me, I think that's part of what I want to better understand is to your point, like, are there ways in which we as a board or the ad hoc committee in this case can start to think about some of these things without creating a volume of work that we don't have a really clear line of sight to? So excellent question. I have the same one. I don't have an answer, but I think it could be something that would be interesting for us to explore, so that we could, make some meaningful progress if that's something that we as a board can do without the ripple effects that we don't want.
So in terms of specific next steps, as we close the workshop today, Bill and I will put together a synopsis of yesterday and today, and we'll summarize to the best as we can where things have landed with regard to the prioritization today. It sounds like, Craig, there's some next steps you want to take with regard to kind of further thinking about this and maybe bringing back another discussion of this work plan at a soon to be scheduled or already scheduled committee meeting. Mm-hmm. Are there other specific next steps that you want to flag that we haven't already flagged?
Well, I'll flag one, and what we'll do as a senior team is to begin to talk about these priorities, Eric, based on the report and what we've shared today. Come back to the board as a whole and give an update, and certainly say, hey, here's what we think. Here's the scope. Here's what this looks like. From our perspective as we review it. And some of them are certainly easier than others. So, but there are some of these, I mean, just getting a common thought around SD9, you heard it today over the last 2 days. It's all over the place, but we narrowed it down a little bit today, which I thought that clarity was really helpful for me, and hopefully it'll be helpful for the team. So let us begin to think about how does this fit into a broader work plan that we have scheduled between now and the end of the year, and as we're working on 2021, what that looks like, and come back to the board, have that conversation maybe at our next board committee meeting. So,
Cool. Well, Craig, with that, I think we are kind of at a nice closing moment in terms of the actions itself. I don't know if there's just final reflections we can do before we close today. If we have a moment or two to go around the room. I know we're a little bit past the hour, but
yeah, I would love just, a couple sentences from each board member, just a reflection on how you're feeling and if there was any aha moments or whatever it is you want to share in a couple sentences, please do.
Okay. Well, anybody want to go first? Let's go ahead and jump in.
I will. So, and good work today. But one of the reasons I brought it up first thing this morning was that I thought we should focus on one SD at a time, is because of the work that we're expecting then the team to do once we make those changes. Because as we saw with SD7, it takes a year to implement any changes to an SD that are of any consequence. So any work on SD9, from my experience on systems committee, it's going to be a long, hard slog. And maybe it's a priority, but it's going to require a lot of time and resources from the entire team that's also working on the decarbonization, working on power with purpose, and it's the same team that's working on that. So that's kind of my feelings, and I think if we can get SD2 figured out and some other aspects and wait for additional time to do SD9, I think an ad hoc is good, but I wouldn't expect a lot of results very soon.
Ann, did you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm just thrilled at the evolution of this entire past 5 years. I think we've really grown, and I think we're at the point that we're looking at each of these SDs and refining them, and I think that's really, really good. And I was sort of giggling with the resource planning thing because 5 years ago, I wanted to do something similar to what Eric wanted as a separate SD, and they said, no, that's just going to be in the resource plan. So that discussion has been going on for about 5 years. So it is to be continued.
Thanks, Amanda.
Oh, here I am. Okay. I think that one of the challenges we have as we look to do these revisions is that we need to keep in mind that our policies need to be a driving force for the organization, not just simply responding to what the organization's already doing. And so, you know, when we're talking about adding resiliency language or the integrated resource planning, how I constantly ask myself, well, how can we add to this to drive the organization forward to be even better than it already is? So certainly that's the challenge ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Rick?
Thank you for the opportunity. I'll echo what Director McGuire said. I think certainly I wasn't here 5 years ago. I do remember her comment that there was about her attempt to do something about market transformation, and I appreciate it. I think really that's what I got out of these events, both past and this time. I wish we had more time to discuss meaningfully what we've been discussing for the past 2 days. And I really appreciate the opportunity and thank you for facilitating this.
You bet, Rick. Eric?
Yeah, I also appreciate this. I think the other things that we had done recently helped me to prepare for this. I think the survey work ahead of time was great. I think the coincidental overlap of SD9 last month in the monitoring report was well timed. I think the board work plan to handle these issues is a great concept. I think that's really going to address a lot of the things we've recently discussed. I am very interested in how the SD9 work goes and how we can recognize the differences between the internal resource planning and policies, the customer engagement and board member engagement with the customers, and the market transformation, how that can be separated out. And I think that we wouldn't have gotten to the level of clarity that we've got on next steps without the coordinated and planned and well-prepared discussion that we've just had. So I appreciate you both being here and all the work staff put into this. And I am excited to see where that potential work on market transformation goes, because that's something I'm very passionate about. And I think it will help to address a lot of the things that have come up in various places, SD 2, 7, 9, 13, over the last couple of years that I've been here. So I think that is a good clear-eyed view of where we can move things forward. And as Amanda said, how policy can help lead improvement into the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Craig?
Yeah, I guess I have a sense of gratitude for everyone that was involved in planning, facilitating, and in particular for my board colleagues for the manner in which you were highly engaged. I started the workshop yesterday by talking about how impressed I am with our work collectively and how I'm always confident that we are really trying to work towards creating the best utility that we can. And I think that was evidenced today. Are our words perfect every single time we open our mouths? Of course not. So I hope that, you know, we all sort of have a lot of forgiveness and grace for one another, to use that term again, for the manner in which we're approaching it. I think everybody is extraordinarily well intentioned. And, you know, through the modern technology, we're kind of fighting our way through this to work towards creating a better utility. So I appreciate everyone's work, and I'm impressed with the way in which you've dove into it.
Great. Thank you, Craig. Tim, do you want to have the last word today, and then we can adjourn?
I would just say this to Craig's point. I think our visions are very similar, that we want a utility that is absolutely freaking amazing, from our customers' perspective, from our communities in which we serve perspective. The challenge for both of us in our roles as executors of strategic directives versus developers of strategic directives, I think, is in the pace on how we make those changes, and the effectiveness in which we make them. And I would just ask for continued patience in our ability to execute, because we want to do it in the most effective and excellent manner. And sometimes that doesn't always align with expectations, and I get that, and I'll take accountability for that. But we are moving this organization faster, but our ideals, I think, are aligned incredibly well. So thank you for that. Thanks for the last 2 days.
Mm-hmm. Well, Bill, on behalf of you and myself, thank you very much. Again, always an honor to work with this board and this team. So thank you very much. And with that, we will adjourn, and we will see you all next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
directors.
you.
Appreciate it. Thanks,
Bye.
senior team.
Thanks. This is great.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.